The scars on Rose O'Malley's hands caught the afternoon sun as she hung laundry on the line, each mark telling a story of survival that the people of Willow Creek, Arizona, had long since twisted into rumors of shame. The year was 1878, and while the West offered freedom to many, it had become Rose's prison of whispers and sidelong glances. She tugged her sleeves down reflexively when she heard approaching hoofbeats, the instinct to hide as natural to her now as breathing. Rose had arrived in Willow Creek 3 years ago with nothing but determination and the skills her grandmother had taught her. At 23, she had managed to build a modest living as a seamstress, despite the challenges her scarred hands presented. The burns that covered both palms and stretched up to her wrists were the result of a fire that had claimed her family home back in Boston. Rose had escaped with her life, but not without carrying permanent reminders of that terrible night. The hoofbeats grew louder, and Rose glanced up to see a rider approaching her small cabin at the edge of town. She didn't recognize the man, which was unusual in a town as small as Willow Creek. He sat tall in the saddle, dust covering his dark clothes and the brim of his hat pulled low against the Arizona sun. "Afternoon, madam," he called as he drew his horse to a stop a respectful distance away. "Good afternoon," Rose replied cautiously, tucking her hands into the folds of her skirt. Strangers meant new eyes to judge, new mouths to spread tales. "Name's Colton Archer," he said, dismounting with the easy grace of a man who'd spent most of his life on horseback. "Just rode into town. Blacksmith mentioned you might be able to mend this." He held up a torn saddlebag. Rose hesitated. New customers were always welcome. Her small cabin needed repairs before winter, and funds were running short. But new customers also meant exposing her hands to fresh scrutiny. "I can fix it," she said finally. "It'll be ready tomorrow afternoon." Colton Archer studied her for a moment, his gaze direct but not unkind. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 28 or 29, with eyes the color of the sky after a storm. "Much obliged. Been on the trail for weeks. Heading to my uncle's ranch about 10 miles west." "The old Peterson place?" Rose asked, recognizing the direction. "That's right. Uncle Frank passed last winter. Left it to me." He handed over the saddlebag. "What do I owe you?" 50 cents. You can pay when you collect it." As she reached for the bag, her sleeve rode up, exposing the mottled skin of her right wrist. She saw his eyes flicker to the scars before she could pull her sleeve down. The familiar shame washed over her, hot and suffocating. "Tomorrow afternoon, then," she said quickly, turning away. "Tomorrow," he agreed, and there was something in his voice that made her look back. He wasn't staring at her hands with disgust or morbid curiosity like so many others did. Instead, he touched the brim of his hat in a polite gesture and remounted his horse. Rose watched him ride away, the saddlebag clutched against her chest. Something about Colton Archer unsettled her, and it wasn't just the lack of revulsion in his eyes when he'd glimpsed her scars. It was the way he'd looked at her face instead, like he was seeing her, not just the damaged parts the town had reduced her to. That evening, Rose worked by lamplight, her nimble fingers guiding the needle through the thick leather of the saddlebag. Despite the scars, her hands were skilled, the burns having spared her dexterity if not her appearance. As she worked, she found herself wondering about the saddlebag's owner. Cowboys rarely stayed in one place long, and ranchers were often too busy with their own concerns to pay much mind to a scarred seamstress on the edge of town, which was just as well. The last time Rose had allowed herself to hope for connection, it had ended in public humiliation. Jonathan Porter, the bank manager's son, had courted her for nearly a month before his true intentions became clear. He'd made a wager with his friends that he could get the monster-handed spinster to agree to a walk under the stars. When she discovered the truth, The laughter had followed her through town for weeks. Rose tied off her final stitch and examined her work. The repair was nearly invisible, the thread matching the worn leather perfectly. She set the bag aside and extinguished the lamp, moonlight filtering through the cabin's single window as she prepared for bed. Morning arrived with the promise of heat, the Arizona sun already blazing as Rose made her way into town for supplies. She needed thread and had promised to deliver Mrs. Peterson's mended tablecloth. The general store was her first stop, and she braced herself as she pushed open the door. "Morning, Miss O'Malley," Mr. Harper greeted from behind the counter. His wife stood nearby, arranging bolts of fabric. "Good morning," Rose replied, keeping her voice even. "I need 2 spools of black thread and 1 of navy blue, please." As Mr. Harper gathered her items, the bell above the door jingled. Rose didn't need to turn to know who had entered. The sudden hush of whispers told her everything. "Why, if it isn't our scarred little seamstress," came the honey-coated voice of Vivian Thompson, daughter of the town's wealthiest rancher. "Still hiding those horrible hands, I see." Rose kept her eyes on the counter. "Just getting my thread, Vivian. How fortunate for you that thread doesn't mind being touched by such deformities." Vivian's companion, Eliza Watson, giggled on cue. Mr. Harper cleared his throat uncomfortably but said nothing. "No one ever did." "I hear you've met the newcomer," Vivian continued, her voice carrying through the store. "Poor man probably doesn't realize what he's gotten himself into, asking you to mend his things. Someone should warn him that whatever you touch is tainted." Rose felt heat rise to her cheeks. She paid for her thread quickly and turned to leave, only to find Vivian blocking her path. "Let me pass, please," Rose said quietly. Vivian smiled, a predatory curve of painted lips. "Of course, I wouldn't want to get too close. Who knows if whatever caused those hands might spread." She stepped aside with exaggerated caution. Rose hurried out, the bell jangling harshly behind her. She nearly collided with someone on the boardwalk, a solid chest in a dusty shirt. Hands steadied her, strong and sure. "Whoa there," said a familiar voice. "You all right, Miss O'Malley?" Rose looked up into the face of Colton Archer. His expression was concerned, his hands still on her arms. She stepped back quickly, tucking her purchases into her basket. "I'm fine, Mr. Archer. Your saddlebag is ready. Actually, I was hoping to speak with you about another matter." His eyes moved past her to the store window, where Vivian and Eliza watched with undisguised interest. Perhaps somewhere less crowded. Rose hesitated. Experience had taught her to be wary of men seeking private conversations, but something in Colton's straightforward gaze made her nod. "I was heading to deliver some mending to Mrs. Peterson. You could walk with me if you like." They moved down the street together, Rose acutely aware of the eyes following them. Colton matched his stride to hers, seemingly unbothered by the attention. "I wanted to ask if you'd consider taking on a larger job," he said as they turned onto a quieter street. "The ranch house needs curtains, and the existing ones are beyond salvaging. Uncle Frank wasn't much for housekeeping." Rose glanced at him, surprised. "There are other seamstresses in town with more experience in home furnishings." "Maybe so, but the work of yours I've seen is exceptional." He stopped walking, turning to face her directly. "Look, Miss O'Malley, I get the feeling you're wondering why I'm asking you specifically. Truth is, I noticed how some folks in town treat you. My uncle mentioned it in his letters before he passed." Rose stiffened. "I don't need your pity, Mr. Archer." "It's not pity," he said firmly. "It's respect for good work. And maybe I understand something about being judged for things beyond your control." His hand moved unconsciously to his side, a gesture Rose couldn't interpret. "I'll pay fair wages," he continued, "and provide transportation to and from the ranch." Rose considered his offer. The extra money would help with the cabin repairs, and working at the Archer Ranch would mean temporary escape from town gossip. I'll need to see the windows first to measure properly. A smile broke across his face, transforming his weathered features. I can bring you out there tomorrow if that suits. That would be acceptable, Rose agreed, surprised by how easily the decision came. Excellent. He touched the brim of his hat. I'll collect you at 9 then. After delivering Mrs. Peterson's tablecloth, Rose returned home with her thoughts in turmoil. She couldn't understand Colton Archer's motives. If not pity, then what? Men like him, handsome, capable, unbroken, didn't seek the company of women like her without reason. The next morning, Rose was ready when Colton arrived with a wagon instead of his horse. He helped her up to the seat with a respectful hand at her elbow, careful not to touch her scarred hands. The gesture, while considerate, only highlighted what made her different. The ride to the Archer Ranch took nearly an hour, the wagon jostling over rugged terrain. Colton spoke easily about his plans for the property, expanding the cattle operation, repairing fences, making the house livable again. Uncle Frank wrote to me for years, asking me to come help him run this place, he explained. I was riding with a cattle outfit in Colorado, never staying in one place too long. Didn't think I was cut out for settling down. What changed? Rose asked, genuinely curious. Colton was quiet for a moment. Got tired of drifting, I suppose, and when Uncle Frank passed, it felt like a sign. A chance to build something that would last. The ranch came into view as they crested a small rise, a modest main house with several outbuildings, nestled against rolling grasslands that stretched toward distant mountains. It wasn't as grand as the Thompson spread, but Rose could see its potential. It's lovely, she said sincerely. It needs work, Colton replied, but his tone was proud. House most of all. Inside, Rose understood what he meant. The rooms were dusty and neglected, with faded curtains hanging in tatters at the windows. She moved through the house, measuring windows and taking notes, while Colton cleared away some of his uncle's old belongings. What happened? He asked suddenly, as Rose was measuring the parlor windows. She turned to find him watching her, his expression unreadable. I beg your pardon? Your hands, he said, gesturing toward them. If you don't mind my asking. Rose instinctively tucked her hands behind her back, her throat tight. No one in Willow Creek had ever directly asked. They'd simply made assumptions and spread rumors. There was a fire, she said finally, in Boston when I was 18. Our house. My parents didn't survive. Colton's expression softened. I'm sorry. I tried to save them, Rose continued, the words coming easier than she'd expected. The flames were everywhere. I managed to get to their room, but the ceiling collapsed. I barely made it out myself. You were brave, he said simply. Rose looked away, uncomfortable with his assessment. It wasn't bravery. It was desperation. Still takes courage to run into fire. He moved to the window beside her, looking out at the land. Those scars tell a story of love and sacrifice. Nothing to be ashamed of. The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. For a moment, Rose allowed herself to see her hands as he described them, badges of courage rather than marks of shame. Then reality reasserted itself. The people of Willow Creek don't see it that way, she said quietly. Then they're fools, Colton replied, his voice hardening. Small minds in a big country. The rest of the morning passed in companionable work. Rose completed her measurements and discussed fabric options, while Colton cleared years of dust and neglect from the main rooms. They shared a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and apples on the porch, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead. I think I can have the curtains ready within 2 weeks, Rose said as they prepared to return to town. I'll need to order some of the fabric from Tucson. No rush, Colton assured her. I'm still sleeping in the bunkhouse while I get the main house in order. On the ride back, Rose found herself more relaxed in Colton's company than she'd been with anyone in years. He didn't stare at her hands or avoid looking at them with exaggerated care. He simply treated her like any other person, a courtesy so rare it felt almost like a gift. The next few days established a pattern. Rose worked on Colton's saddlebag and other mending from town customers, while making preparations for the curtain project. Colton stopped by her cabin every other day, sometimes with small jobs that needed mending, sometimes just to check on her progress or bring supplies from town. Their friendship for Rose had begun to think of it as such drew attention. She noticed the whispers increase when she walked through town, saw the knowing looks exchanged when Colton's name was mentioned. Vivian Thompson made a point of cornering her outside the church one Sunday. My father says Colton Archer is making significant improvements to his uncle's old place, Vivian said, twirling her parasol. He must be quite desperate for companionship if he's seeking yours. Rose kept her expression neutral. Mr. Archer is a client, nothing more. Of course, Vivian smiled coldly. What else could you be to any man with eyes in his head? Those hands of yours, they're enough to turn a person's stomach. The words stung as they were meant to. Rose had heard worse, but somehow Vivian's cruelty felt sharper now that she'd experienced Colton's kindness. Excuse me, Rose said, moving to step around her. Vivian blocked her path. I should warn you, my father has invited Mr. Archer to dinner next week. Daddy's always looking for promising new ranchers to join our circle, and I'll be sure to keep Mr. Archer thoroughly entertained. I'm sure you will, Rose replied evenly. Now, if you'll pardon me. She walked away with her head high, refusing to let Vivian see how the encounter had affected her. It shouldn't matter what Vivian did or whom she entertained. Colton Archer was indeed just a client, a friendly one, perhaps, but nothing more. Yet as Rose worked on the curtain fabric that afternoon, she found herself distracted by thoughts of Colton dining at the Thompson estate, of Vivian flirting with him in her practiced way. The images bothered her more than they should have. 3 days later, Colton arrived at her cabin with his wagon to transport the first set of completed curtains to the ranch. Rose had worked tirelessly, her fingers sore from the heavy fabric, but the results were worth the effort. The deep green material would complement the natural wood of the house while providing much-needed privacy and protection from the sun. These are magnificent, Colton said, running his hand over the fabric. You've outdone yourself, Miss O'Malley. Rose, she said impulsively. You might as well call me Rose, considering how often we've been in each other's company lately. He smiled, the expression warming his features. Rose it is, then. And I'm Colton, not Mr. Archer. The ride to the ranch was pleasant, the early autumn air crisp without being cold. Rose found herself looking forward to seeing the curtains hung in their proper place. I hear you've been invited to dine with the Thompsons, she said, trying to sound casual. Colton nodded. Edward Thompson came by the ranch yesterday. Seems mighty interested in my plans for the place. The Thompsons are the most influential family in the county, Rose explained, and Vivian is considered the most eligible young woman in 3 territories. Colton gave her a sidelong glance. Is that so? Well, I've declined the invitation. Rose couldn't hide her surprise. Why would you do that? Because Edward Thompson spent 20 minutes talking about the unfortunate element in Willow Creek that needs to be discouraged from remaining in the area. Colton's jaw tightened. Didn't take much to figure out he was including you in that category. Rose looked down at her hands, a mixture of emotions washing over her. You shouldn't make enemies on my account. I'm not in the habit of breaking bread with people who judge others based on appearances, he said firmly. Besides, I told them I already had plans that evening. What plans? His smile returned. I'm having dinner with a talented seamstress who's helping make my house a home. Rose felt warmth spread through her chest, followed quickly by caution. I don't think that would be wise, Colton. People already talk. Let them, he said with a shrug. Unless you're opposed to the idea? She wasn't, which was precisely what worried her. I just don't want to cause you any difficulty in establishing yourself here. The only difficulty would be pretending to enjoy Vivian Thompson's company when I could be enjoying yours instead. His candor left her momentarily speechless. At the ranch, they worked together to hang the curtains. The transformation was immediate. The house suddenly felt more like a home, the green fabric casting a warm glow when the sun shone through it. Perfect, Colton declared, standing back to admire the parlor windows. Just as I imagined it. Rose felt a surge of pride. This was why she continued her work despite the challenges, the satisfaction of creating something beautiful and useful with her own hands. The bedroom curtains will be ready next week, she said, gathering her measuring tape and pins. Stay for dinner, Colton said suddenly. I'm not much of a cook, but I can manage beans and biscuits without burning the place down. Rose hesitated, but only briefly. The prospect of returning to her empty cabin seemed increasingly unappealing. I'd like that. They ate on the porch as the sun set, painting the landscape in gold and crimson. Colton told stories of his years driving cattle, of sleeping under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, of the characters he'd met along the way. Rose found herself laughing more than she had in years. What brought you to Willow Creek? He asked as darkness settled around them. After Boston, Rose took a sip of coffee before answering. I had a distant cousin who lived here. She was the only family I had left after the fire. She died the winter after I arrived. Pneumonia. By then, I'd established my seamstress business, so I stayed. Despite how people treated you, I didn't have the means to go elsewhere, she admitted. And I suppose part of me was too stubborn to be driven away by gossip and stares. Colton nodded, understanding in his eyes. Stubbornness is an underrated virtue out here. As he drove her home later that evening, stars scattered across the velvet sky above them, Rose felt a contentment she'd almost forgotten was possible. She knew it was dangerous to become accustomed to Colton's company, to begin expecting his kindness. Yet she couldn't help the way her heart lifted when he helped her down from the wagon and walked her to her door. Thank you for dinner, she said, suddenly shy in the darkness. Thank you for the curtains, he replied, and the company. He stood there for a moment, as if wanting to say more, before touching the brim of his hat. Good night, Rose. Good night, Colton. She watched him drive away, the lantern on his wagon creating a small pool of light that gradually disappeared into the night. Only when she could no longer see it did she enter her cabin, the space seeming smaller and emptier than before. The next week brought a flurry of activity. Rose completed the remaining curtains for Colton's house while also working on orders for several town residents. Autumn was deepening, and with it came increased demand for warmer clothing and household repairs before winter set in. She was returning from a delivery to the Widow Parker when she encountered Sheriff Miller outside the general store. His expression told her something was wrong before he even spoke. Miss O'Malley, he said, removing his hat. Might I have a word? Rose nodded, her stomach tightening. Sheriff Miller was generally fair, but he was also heavily influenced by the town's prominent citizens. I've received some complaints, he began, looking uncomfortable. About your association with Mr. Archer. My association? Rose repeated, keeping her voice level. Several concerned citizens have mentioned that you've been spending time alone with him at his ranch. The sheriff cleared his throat. Given your profession and standing in the community, such behavior could be seen as inappropriate. Rose felt heat rise to her face. I've been making curtains for his house, Sheriff. That hardly constitutes inappropriate behavior. Be that as it may, he continued. Edward Thompson has expressed concern about the example being set for the younger ladies in town. He suggested it might be best if you conducted your business transactions in a more public manner. I see, Rose said, her voice tight. And does Mr. Thompson dictate how all businesses in town should operate, or just mine? Sheriff Miller had the grace to look embarrassed. No one's dictating anything, Miss O'Malley. Just a friendly suggestion to avoid any misunderstandings. The only misunderstanding, Rose said, is the assumption that my professional dealings are anyone's concern but my own and my clients'. She straightened her shoulders. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to attend to. She walked away, her hands trembling with a mixture of anger and humiliation. So this was Edward Thompson's response to Colton's rejected dinner invitation, a thinly veiled attempt to damage her reputation and perhaps discourage Colton from continuing their association. When Colton arrived the next day to collect the remaining curtains, Rose was still seething. She told him about the sheriff's friendly suggestion as they loaded the fabric into his wagon. That's outrageous, Colton said, his expression darkening. Thompson has no right to interfere in your business. He has influence, Rose pointed out, and apparently he's using it to punish you for declining his invitation by targeting me. Colton ran a hand through his hair in frustration. I should have a word with him. No, Rose said quickly. That would only make things worse. The Thompsons have been in this territory for 3 generations. They can make life very difficult for newcomers who don't fall in line. I don't much care for falling in line, Colton said grimly. Especially not when the line is being drawn by a man like Thompson. Rose placed a hand on his arm, the contact so natural she didn't think to hide her scars. Please, Colton, I've managed this long. I can weather a little more gossip. He looked down at her hand on his sleeve, then covered it with his own before she could withdraw it. His palm was warm against her scarred skin, his touch gentle but firm. You shouldn't have to, he said quietly. No one should be treated the way this town treats you. The moment stretched between them, intimate and charged with unspoken feelings. Rose finally pulled her hand away, uncomfortable with the emotions rising within her. We should get these curtains to the ranch, she said, her voice not quite steady. The tension remained as they drove to the ranch, each lost in their own thoughts. Rose tried to focus on the practical matter of hanging the curtains, not on the way Colton's touch had made her feel or the anger in his eyes when she told him about the sheriff's warning. They worked efficiently, transforming the remaining rooms with the new curtains. By late afternoon, the entire house had taken on a different character, warmer, more inviting, a true home rather than just a structure. It's like a different place entirely, Colton said as they stood in the kitchen, admiring the soft yellow curtains that now framed the windows. You've worked magic here, Rose. Hardly magic, she demurred. Just fabric and thread. In your hands, they become something more. He stepped closer to her, his expression serious. I'd like to show you something. Something I haven't shown anyone else in Willow Creek. Curious, Rose followed him to the small study off the main parlor. Colton closed the door behind them and lit a lamp, illuminating a room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large desk. Uncle Frank was quite the reader, Colton explained, moving to the desk. But that's not what I wanted to show you. He unbuttoned his shirt halfway, then turned so his left side was visible in the lamplight. A massive scar ran from just below his ribs around to his back, the skin puckered and discolored. Comanche raid 6 years ago, he said quietly. I was driving cattle near the Texas border. Arrow went clean through. The trail boss said it was a miracle I survived. Rose stared at the scar, understanding dawning. This is why you didn't react to my hands. Colton nodded, rebut-toning his shirt. First time I saw your scars, I recognized something familiar. Not just the marks themselves, but the way you try to hide them. The shame that isn't yours to carry. Your scar doesn't show when you're dressed, Rose pointed out. You can hide it from the world. And you think that makes it easier? He asked gently. The hiding becomes its own kind of prison, Rose. I've watched you tuck your hands away, seen you flinch when people look at them. I know what that feels like, to worry that people will see the damaged parts and nothing else. Rose felt tears threatening and blinked them back. Why are you telling me this? Because I want you to know you're not alone, he said, moving closer. And because I'm tired of hiding. Not just my scar, but how I feel about you. Her heart stuttered. How you feel? From the moment I saw you hanging laundry in the sunlight, I couldn't look away. Not because of your hands, but because of the grace in every movement, the quiet strength in your eyes. He paused, as if gathering courage. I'm falling in love with you, Rose O'Malley, and it terrifies me more than any Comanche raid ever did. Rose felt the world shift beneath her feet. You can't mean that. You don't even know me. I know enough, he insisted. I know you're kind and talented and stronger than anyone gives you credit for. I know you face cruelty with dignity. I know your laugh makes me feel like I've finally found a place I belong. Colton, she whispered, his name both a caution and a plea. The town will never accept this. They barely tolerate me as it is. To hell with the town, he said fiercely. Their opinions matter only if we let them. Before she could respond, he took her hands in his, not avoiding the scars but cradling them gently, his thumbs brushing over the damaged skin. These hands survived fire to create beauty, he said, his voice husky with emotion. How could I see them as anything but magnificent? And then, as Rose watched in disbelief, Colton lifted her right hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her scarred palm. The tenderness of the gesture broke something loose inside her, a dam of emotion she'd held back for years. They're ugly, she protested weakly, tears finally spilling over. Everyone says so. They're beautiful, he corrected, kissing her left palm with the same reverence. They're part of you, and everything about you is beautiful to me. Rose couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the unconditional acceptance in his eyes, in his touch. He drew her closer, one hand rising to cup her cheek. May I kiss you, Rose? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, unable to form words. His lips met hers with exquisite gentleness, a kiss that promised protection without ownership, passion without demand. Rose found herself responding, her scarred hands coming to rest against his chest, feeling his heartbeat strong and steady beneath her fingers. When they finally parted, Rose kept her eyes closed for a moment, afraid that opening them would break the spell. But when she looked at Colton, he was still there, still gazing at her with warmth that chased away the shadows of years of rejection. I don't know what happens now, she admitted. Now, he said, smiling. We figure it out together. If you'll have me. People will talk, she warned, practical concerns reasserting themselves. People already talk, he pointed out. Might as well give them something worth talking about. That evening, Colton drove Rose home beneath a canopy of stars, their hands intertwined on the seat between them. They spoke of practical matters, the remaining work on the ranch house, Rose's upcoming orders, the approaching winter, but beneath the ordinary conversation ran a current of joy neither could fully contain. At her cabin door, Colton kissed her again, lingering a little longer this time. Have dinner with me tomorrow? He asked. At the hotel restaurant, in full view of the entire town. Rose hesitated only briefly before nodding. Yes. His smile lit up the darkness. Until tomorrow, then. News of their dinner date spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. Rose felt the stares as she walked to the hotel the following evening, heard the whispers behind gloved hands. She'd worn her best dress, a deep blue that complemented her auburn hair, and held her head high despite the murmurs. Colton was waiting for her in the hotel lobby, handsome in a clean shirt and vest, his usually unruly hair combed neatly. The warmth in his eyes when he saw her made the stares and whispers fade to insignificance. "You look beautiful," he said, offering his arm. "Thank you," she replied, placing her scarred hand on his sleeve without concealing it. The small act of courage was rewarded by his proud smile. The hotel dining room fell silent as they entered, every head turning to watch their progress to a table near the window. Rose recognized several prominent townspeople, including Sheriff Miller and, to her dismay, Edward and Vivian Thompson at a corner table. "Quite an audience," Colton murmured as he held her chair. "Having second thoughts?" Rose asked, only half joking. "Not a single one," he assured her, taking the seat opposite. They ordered their meal, making conversation despite the scrutiny from neighboring tables. Gradually, the initial hush gave way to resumed discussions, though Rose could still feel occasional glances in their direction. "Mr. Archer," came a honeyed voice from beside their table. "What a pleasant surprise." Vivian Thompson stood there in an elaborately trimmed green dress, her father hovering behind her. She pointedly avoided looking at Rose. "Miss Thompson," Colton acknowledged with a polite nod. "Mr. Thompson, we missed you at dinner last week," Edward Thompson said, his jovial tone belied by the coldness in his eyes. Vivian was quite disappointed. "I had a prior commitment," Colton replied evenly. "Miss O'Malley has been kind enough to help make my uncle's house livable again." Vivian's smile tightened. How charitable of her, though one wonders about the wisdom of spending so much time alone with a seamstress. The emphasis she placed on Rose's profession made it sound like something shameful. Rose felt her cheeks burn but kept her expression neutral. "I wonder about the wisdom of many things, Miss Thompson," Colton said, his voice pleasant but with an edge of steel. "For instance, why some folks feel entitled to judge others based on appearances or circumstances beyond their control." Edward Thompson's face darkened. "You're new to these parts, Archer. You might want to consider who your friends are in this territory." "I've given it considerable thought," Colton replied, reaching across the table to take Rose's hand in full view of everyone. "And I'm quite satisfied with my choice." A scandalized murmur ran through the dining room. Vivian's face contorted with fury before she schooled it back into a semblance of composure. "Well," she said icily, "I see you've made your position clear. Come, father." They returned to their table, Vivian's back rigid with indignation. Colton squeezed Rose's hand gently before releasing it. "I'm sorry," Rose said quietly. "You've just made an enemy of the most powerful man in the county. Edward Thompson doesn't own this territory, despite what he thinks," Colton replied. "And I meant what I said. I'm satisfied with my choice." The remainder of their meal passed without further incident, though Rose remained acutely aware of the whispers and stares. When they left the hotel, Colton walked her home through the quiet streets, the moon lighting their path. "Thank you for tonight," Rose said as they reached her cabin. "For standing up to the Thompsons." "I should be thanking you for your courage," he replied. "It can't have been easy, facing all those stares." "It was easier with you beside me." She looked up at him, still marveling that this man, this kind, brave man, had chosen her despite everything. Colton brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch reverent. "May I call on you properly, Rose O'Malley?" "Court you as you deserve to be courted." "Yes," she said simply, her heart too full for elaborate words. His kiss was gentle but held a promise of deeper passion, of a future neither had dared imagine until now. When they parted, Rose touched his cheek, her scarred fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "Good night, Colton. Good night, my beautiful Rose." The weeks that followed were both wonderful and difficult. True to his word, Colton courted Rose, openly taking her on buggy rides through the countryside, escorting her to church on Sundays, bringing small gifts that showed how well he was coming to know her. Each gesture was a declaration to the town that he was proud to be seen with her, scarred hands and all. The town's reaction was divided. Some, like Mrs. Peterson and the blacksmith, seemed cautiously accepting of the relationship. Others, led by the Thompsons, made their disapproval painfully clear. Business at Rose's seamstress shop declined as several prominent customers suddenly found other arrangements for their mending. "They'll come around," Colton assured her one evening as they sat on her porch watching the sunset. "Or they won't. Either way, we'll manage." Rose wasn't so certain. The loss of income worried her, especially with winter approaching. Yet she couldn't bring herself to regret her relationship with Colton, even as it complicated her already precarious position in Willow Creek. One crisp November morning, Rose was working on a quilt when an urgent knock sounded at her door. She opened it to find Mrs. Peterson, her usually calm face creased with concern. "Rose, dear, you need to come quickly," the older woman said. "There's trouble at the general store." "What kind of trouble?" Rose asked, reaching for her shawl. "It's Mr. Archer. He and Edward Thompson are having words, and it's getting heated." Rose hurried into town, dread building with each step. She found a crowd gathered outside Harper's General Store and pushed her way through to see Colton and Edward Thompson facing each other on the boardwalk, neither man backing down. "I won't say it again, Archer," Thompson was saying, his face flushed with anger. "Your cattle have no business on my grazing land. That creek has been common water access for every ranch in this valley since before your father staked his claim," Colton replied evenly. "Frank's records show it clear as day. Your uncle was a senile old fool who couldn't manage his own affairs," Thompson sneered. "Much like his nephew, who seems to have equally poor judgment in business and personal matters." Colton's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "My personal life is none of your concern, Thompson. It becomes my concern when you parade your association with damaged goods through town, setting a poor example for decent folks." Thompson's eyes flickered to Rose as she stepped forward, his lip curling in disgust. "There she is now, the reason you've rejected proper society in favor of a freak with monster hands." The crowd gasped at the cruelty of his words. Rose felt them like physical blows, but forced herself to stand straight, refusing to hide her hands or her face. "That's enough," Colton said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Apologize to Miss O'Malley." Thompson laughed. "Or what? You'll challenge me to a duel? This isn't some romantic novel, boy. This is real life, where men of substance don't waste their time on damaged women." Colton moved so quickly that Rose barely saw it happen. One moment he was standing 3 feet from Thompson, the next he had the older man by his expensive lapels, lifting him slightly off the ground. "Apologize," Colton repeated, each syllable distinct. Fear flashed across Thompson's face, quickly replaced by outrage. "Take your hands off me, or I'll have the sheriff arrest you for assault." "Go ahead," Colton said, not releasing his grip. "But first, you'll apologize to the woman I intend to marry." A murmur ran through the crowd. Rose felt her heart skip at Colton's words, even as she worried about the consequences of this confrontation. "Colton," she said softly, stepping forward to touch his arm. "Let him go. He's not worth it." Colton looked at her, conflict evident in his eyes. After a moment, he released Thompson, who staggered slightly before straightening his jacket with as much dignity as he could muster. "You've made a powerful enemy today, Archer," Thompson said, his voice shaking with rage. "Both of you will regret this." He stormed away, the crowd parting to let him pass. Slowly, the onlookers began to disperse, some casting sympathetic glances at Rose, others avoiding her eyes entirely. "Did you mean that?" Rose asked when they were relatively alone. "About intending to marry me?" Colton turned to her, his anger fading into tenderness. "I did. Though I'd planned a more romantic proposal than shouting it in front of half the town during an argument." Despite everything, Rose felt a bubble of laughter rise in her throat. It was certainly memorable. "I love you, Rose O'Malley," he said, taking her hands in his scarred palms up, exposed to the world. "I want to build a life with you. Will you marry me?" Rose looked at their joined hands, at this man who saw beauty where others saw only damage, who offered her a future she'd stopped believing was possible. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and sure. "Yes, I'll marry you." He kissed her then, right there on the main street of Willow Creek, unconcerned with who might be watching. And for the first time since the fire that had scarred her hands and her heart, Rose felt truly whole. The weeks that followed brought significant changes. True to his threat, Edward Thompson used his influence to make life difficult for them both. The bank suddenly recalled a loan on Colton's ranch, forcing him to scramble for alternative financing. Several of Rose's remaining customers withdrew their business, citing vague excuses. Yet for every door that closed, another seemed to open. Mrs. Peterson introduced Rose to her niece in Tucson, who commissioned an elaborate wedding dress. The blacksmith arranged for Colton to supply horses to the cavalry at Fort Bowie, providing a new source of income for the ranch. Most surprisingly, Vivian Thompson herself appeared at Rose's cabin one afternoon in early December, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Miss O'Malley," she said stiffly when Rose opened the door. "May I speak with you?" Puzzled, Rose invited her in. Vivian perched on the edge of a chair, removing her gloves with precise movements. "I've come to commission a dress," she said without preamble, "for the Christmas social." Rose couldn't hide her surprise. My father doesn't dictate my choice of seamstress," Vivian interrupted, though they both knew this wasn't entirely true. "I've seen your work. It's superior to anything available in Willow Creek." Still suspicious, Rose studied the younger woman. "Why now, Vivian? After everything that's happened?" Vivian looked down, a flush spreading across her cheeks. "My father isn't always right," she said quietly. "About many things, but especially about you. I've been unkind, without cause." The admission clearly cost her considerable pride. Rose sat down across from her, struggling to reconcile this contrite Vivian with the woman who had tormented her for years. "What changed your mind?" Rose asked. Vivian hesitated. "Lieutenant James arrived at Fort Bowie last month. We've been corresponding. He lost an arm at Little Bighorn. When he heard how my father spoke about your hands, he was furious." Her voice softened. "He said scars are the map of a person's courage." Rose was momentarily speechless. "That's a beautiful sentiment." "He's a beautiful soul," Vivian said, and for the first time, Rose saw genuine emotion in her eyes. "And he made me see that I've been small and cruel. I can't undo that, but I can try to be better." Rose nodded slowly. "I'd be happy to make your dress, Vivian." "Thank you," Vivian said, relief evident in her voice. "And I hope you'll both attend the social as my guests." It was an olive branch, offered with surprising sincerity. Rose accepted it with equal grace. "We'd be honored." After Vivian left, Rose sat quietly, reflecting on the unexpected turn of events. People could change, it seemed, not just Vivian but the town itself. The whispers hadn't stopped entirely, but they were softening, transforming from malicious gossip to curious speculation about the upcoming wedding. Colton and Rose were married on Christmas Eve in a small ceremony at the ranch. Mrs. Peterson had helped decorate the house with pine boughs and red ribbons, and the curtains Rose had made framed windows that glowed with warm lamplight as snow began to fall outside. The guest list surprised them both. Not only did their few confirmed friends attend, but also the sheriff and his wife, the Harpers from the general store, and even Vivian Thompson, escorted by a handsome lieutenant with an empty sleeve pinned neatly to his uniform. Edward Thompson was conspicuously absent, his opposition to the union unchanged despite his daughter's softening attitude. But his absence did little to dampen the joy of the occasion. Rose wore a dress of deep ivory, simple but elegant, with sleeves that ended at her wrists. When the time came to exchange rings, she offered her hands without hesitation, the scars visible to all. Colton took them reverently, sliding the gold band onto her finger before raising her palms to his lips. "These beautiful hands," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "have brought light and love into my life. I am honored to hold them for all our days to come." There wasn't a dry eye in the room as they sealed their vows with a kiss, the promise of a future built on acceptance and love stretching before them like the untamed landscape beyond the windows. Spring arrived with new beginnings. The ranch flourished under Colton's care, the cattle herd growing as he implemented the innovations he'd learned during his years on the trail. Rose continued her seamstress work, but now divided her time between town clients and making their house truly a home. On a warm April afternoon, as they sat on the porch watching a thunderstorm roll across the distant mountains, Colton placed his hand over Rose's still flat stomach. "Do you think he'll have your eyes?" he asked, grinning. Rose covered his hand with her own, their wedding bands catching the light. "Or she might have your stubbornness." "Either way," Colton said, drawing her close, "he or she will be perfect." Even if Rose hesitated, a fear she hadn't voiced until now rising to the surface. "Even if our child inherits these." She held up her scarred hands. Colton's expression grew serious. "If our child has your hands, then he or she will have the most beautiful hands in the territory. But more importantly, our child will know that beauty comes in many forms, and that scars are nothing to be ashamed of." Rose leaned into his embrace, her heart full. "I love you, Colton Archer." "And I love you, Rose Archer," he replied, kissing the top of her head, scarred hands and all. As the storm moved closer, bringing life-giving rain to the thirsty land, Rose thought about the journey that had brought her here from the devastating fire that had taken her family and marked her forever, to this moment of perfect contentment in the arms of a man who saw beyond her scars to the woman beneath. In Willow Creek, there were still those who whispered when she passed, still those who stared at her hands with morbid fascination. But increasingly, there were also those who greeted her with genuine warmth, who commissioned her work not out of pity but because of her skill, who accepted Colton's assessment of her hands as beautiful because they had come to see the truth of it themselves. 9 months later, Rose gave birth to a daughter with Colton's storm-blue eyes and a dusting of auburn hair. They named her Faith, for what had carried them through the darkest times and brought them to this moment of joy. As Rose cradled her newborn daughter, her scarred hands gentle against Faith's perfect skin, she felt a completion she had never thought possible. Colton sat beside them on the bed, his expression one of wonder and love. "Thank you," he whispered, pressing a kiss to Rose's temple. "For Faith, for us, for everything." Rose looked down at her hands, the hands that had survived fire, that had created beauty from fabric and thread, that now held their greatest creation. Hands that a brave cowboy had kissed and called beautiful, changing her life forever. "Beautiful," she murmured, echoing his words from that transformative moment in his study months ago. Not in vanity but in acceptance, in truth. Colton smiled, understanding in his eyes as he covered her hands with his own. "Beautiful," he agreed. "Then, now, always." Outside their window, the Arizona sun set over the land they had made their own, painting the sky in colors as vibrant as their love, a love born of acceptance, nurtured by courage, and made stronger by the very scars that others had deemed shameful. For in finding each other, they had discovered a truth more powerful than any judgment. That true beauty lies not in perfection, but in the marks life leaves upon us and the love that transforms them from wounds into wonders.